Hotep family, we're back with Dr. Tommy J. Curry. He just completed a class for the Shock Metaphysics Virtual Comedic Wisdom School that was off the chain. It was absolutely amazing, the research and the data that he went in on. And this presentation, this class that he offered us today was about killing Boogeyman, phallicism, and the misandric mischaracterizations of Black males in theory. Dr. Tommy Curry, that was amazing. Thank you for that.
No, thank you, sir. Thank you for the opportunity.
I just want to have a quick conversation with you for the general population who's going to be watching this that may be interested in your work, maybe have not been introduced to your work, particularly as it relates to our virtual school. You have been doing this work for some period of time. What is the Boogeyman, and how do you define that in terms of phallicism and anti-Black male misandry?
So the Boogeyman is a deviant construct that I argue guides theories. In the academy, we often look at Black men as pathological, hypermasculine, hypersexual, and predatory. So the concept of the Boogeyman is this kind of interpretive allure. It is constantly haunting the way that we interpret data, that we theorize, and the way that we place and position Black men in relationship to other bodies. And that's extremely important because it helps clarify what I think a lot of Black male studies scholars discuss as anti-Black misandry. Mm-hmm. Now, a lot of people react to anti-Black misandry as if it's a men's rights term, and that's an incorrect genealogy of the term. Throughout history, Black men have talked about themselves as victims of sexual racism. We see this in Calvin Hurden's work. We see this in Abdul John Muhammad's work. Some people have referred to Black men's specific experiences of deviance as a gendered racism. You find this in post-intersectionality work, Angela Harris or Matua or even Darren Hutchinson. Anti-Black misandry tries to capture all those terms. Borrowing, of course, from William A. Smith's work on Black misandry in 2012, anti-Black misandry is trying to conceptualize the cumulative assertions of the lack that Black men are theorized as having, as well as their hyper-personality traits, hypermasculinity, hypersexuality, etc., and how those stereotypes justify the sanctioning of Black male life. So because you think Black men are hypermasculine, you think they're going to be more aggressive and dangerous. Because they're hypersexual, you think they're going to be rapists. And it's these stereotypes about Black men, the cumulative assertion of these stereotypes that in many ways direct policy, social perceptions, and phobias are people's fears regarding Black men and Black male bodies, right? And I think that it's something that that gets a lot of evidence, that gets a lot of support from the work that's going on in social dominance theory right now. Social dominance theory was a theory that was developed in the late 1990s by Jim Sedanis and Felicia Prado. And they're evolutionary psychologists, but one of the tremendous insights that I think their theory gives for theorists and Black studies scholars is that it provides an account of how capitalist patriarchal societies target, racialize, or outgroup men. So when they look at retail discrimination, job discrimination, incarceration rates, homicide rates in any particular society, they consistently find that outgroup men are the ones targeted for lethal violence. And because of this finding, they try to make a distinction between the lethal violence that outgroup men suffer and the kinds of violence, or what they say the paternalistic violence or discrimination that in-group and out-group women suffer in a given society. So it's the delineation between violence that's of particular interest to Black male studies scholars, because it's trying to explain this kind of repetitive and almost quotidian, reality that we're confronted with, that every day we're seeing Black men die, right? So it's really impactful, it's really insightful, and it really does give us a new way to think about Black men and racialized men's identities under patriarchy. The term that's closely related to that, however, is phallicism. Mm-hmm. Under arbitrary set discrimination, the idea is that stereotypes about outgroup men are being created to justify their death, right? But what happens when you have to deal with this other reality that we keep finding, which is that black men during slavery, Jim Crow, and even now in police and stop and frisks are constantly victims of rape and sexual assault. How do we understand the historical development of racialized men from slavery all the way through Jim Crow to the Holocaust, right? Even to the Armenian genocide, where racialized males universally seem to have to endure rape and sexual violence as part of their oppression. How do we think about that? Well, phallicism is meant to capture that. So while arbitrary set discrimination provides tremendous resources for how we think about racialized men being killed, phallicism tries to create a theory that explains why racialized men are sexually assaulted and raped. And it's in the combination of these two theories that we're trying to work out an account of misandric aggression and mischaracterization that misses the sexual part, the sexual component of racialized men's oppression that stands alongside and not contrary to their death and dying.
This reminds me of a quote by D.L. Hughley in his latest work, where he says the most dangerous place for a black man is in the imagination of white people.
Yes.
Yes. Yeah. Talk to us about hegemonic masculinity, empiricism, and empiricism effect on theory.
Well, I think there's a huge difference between how we think of black men in the academy and what black men actually are. Right? Hegemonic masculinity was a theory that was developed by R.W.S. Connell, a trans woman looking at Australian boys in boarding schools and trying to give an account of the kind of masculinity that controlled how people thought, behaved, and what they aspired to ideologically. And when she says ideologically, when she's talking about hegemony, she means it in the Gramscian sense, in terms of media, soft power, if you will, ideas, taxation, welfare, these kinds of control of property, etc., not brute force. So what ends up happening far too often is that we conflate hegemonic masculinity with violence or power. And while it does mean power, it is not violence. In fact, masculinity that has to rule through violence is not hegemonic at all, according to Connell. So what we've done in the United States, because people in the United States are not very well read compared to our European counterparts, is we've suggested that all masculinity tends towards hegemony or tends towards toxicity. That is not the case. There are plenty naturally occurring variants of masculinity that have nothing to do with patriarchy. It has nothing to do with hegemony, and are in fact victimized by patriarchy and hegemony. So hegemonic masculinity is a insightful and useful term, but it's also a term that I think black male scholars and other racialized men have had to react to, precisely because feminism and gender studies have made it so universal without the nuance that its original authors actually inquired about. Right. So it's something that does characterize the ideological force of white masculinities, dominant ruling class masculinities, et cetera, but does not get into the protest masculinities of ethnic racial groups. Right. And the only way you could test that is through empiricism. Right. Mm-hmm. You have to go in, you have to study male populations. And in the United States, we're not very good at that. We're not very good at going to study black men because our theoretical orientation towards black men and black boys assumes that we can simply trust the intuitions that certain groups of women have about masculinity. So they never have to test whether or not black men actually believe X. They can just intuit that I believe that black men believe X, hence it becomes true. And this is part of the problem with standpoint epistemology and the experiential objectification of black men in the theories and imaginations of white men, white women, and even other black women. Is that since there's no accountability to the theory that the theory has to reality, there's no ethnographic turn, so to speak, whereby the way that we understand racialized men or men in general is through our interviewing of these men, our study of these men and their life conditions. Basically, it's all conjecture, it's all caricature in theory. So empiricism and the works that we do have on black men show a vastly, vastly different picture than what gender theory suggests. We find that black men are extremely communal, that they're not individualistic, that they're familial. They define themselves on the basis of their family and their race. We find that they participate more in child relationships. We find that they're more communalistic. We find that they have large aspects of social fathering, such that they take in other children even when other men in their communities are absent. And we find that they're extremely supportive of women's rights to work, and the link faith between, or the link fate between black men and black women. So many of the stories that you're getting that suggest that black men don't care about women's rights, that black men have abandoned black women, that black men exploit black women in the homes, is just manifestly false when you look at the empirical evidence.
Wow.
So empiricism is a way to test theory, to hold theory's feet to the ground, so to speak, and make it account for the phenomenology or lived experiences of black men and boys' reality in a way that I don't think is done now. And I think that's why black male studies has such a foot in empiricism and history, because it's looking for the actual artifacts, the actual real world combinations and testimonies of racialized men, be they survivors of the Jewish Holocaust, or whether or not they're black men that are talking about their experiences of stop and frisk or abuse as a child, is trying to get at the actual lived experiences that these group of men have instead of theorizing them from afar.
Wow, that's incredible. Thank you for that. In the class, you also talk about subordinate male target hypothesis. What is it?
Yes. So the subordinate male target hypothesis is the sub-theory, or it's a component of social dominance theory. The subordinate male target hypothesis basically argues that it's outgroup men rather than outgroup women, which is what intersectionality predicts, that will be the target of patriarchal discrimination. One of the things that happened is that when social dominance first proposed this theory in the late 1990s, it was tested offhand, I could think of half a dozen, maybe a dozen times by various authors and literatures. And each time it stood the test of time. They did find that black men specifically reported more acts of racism, higher negative behaviors and perceptions towards them in workplaces, higher levels of discrimination, higher levels of violence than their female counterparts. So in 2008, there was an article written by Purdy, Hughes, and Ibach that tried to rework this thesis to kind of save intersectionality, if you will. And what that theory was intersectional visibility. In the beginning of the article, the authors actually say that, look, the subordinate male target hypothesis has an overwhelming amount of empirical evidence that does not seem can be easily refuted. So in order for us to respond to this, we're going to reinterpret that evidence. We're not going to refute the evidence. We're going to reinterpret it. So was the evidence suggests that the subordinate male target experiences more patriarchal and lethal violence in these kinds of societies run by white men, we're going to suggest that the reason that men experience higher levels of violence is because of their privilege. So it took a measure of oppression, which is death, violence, incarceration, unemployment, etc., and then said that the reason that black men experience those kinds of violence is because patriarchal societies value men more than women. So while women are safer, they're also less valued. And while men are killed more, they're more privileged because they're men. And again, I think this is an example of the kind of genocidal logics that intersectionality propagates in some of its analysis. And I think this is why we have to be very honest about what certain terms and certain kinds of phenomena mean when we're talking about black men and boys' death and direct material oppression.
You talk about gendercide versus genocide, and why is death so greatly associated with black men?
Yeah, still trying to figure that one out. But yeah, so when you look historically at genocide, and this is Adam Jones's work, of course. You find a consistent pattern where racialized men or outgroup men are targeted first and usually more harshly. So what Jones's work has done is given us kind of insight into this gender disparity of genocide, who's first killed, who's killed more harshly, the kind of brutality and force that they're usually dealt with. And, he's really drawing from the work of Earl Miller in his book, Men at Risk. And, again, I think that these authors, these literatures have come to establish a sound theoretical foundation for black male studies to kind of test a lot of its thinking and theory about black men specifically, but racialized males more generally. So when you look at low-level conflicts and you see the extermination of outgroup men first, that aligns, that parallels the kinds of theses that you're getting coming out of social dominance. And mind you, these people work in two different fields. You know, Jones is working in genocide, Sedanius is working in psychology, and they basically come to the exact same conclusion. You fast forward 15 years, you know, I come up with the man not frame, which makes the exact same argument, but implicating sexual violence. So you have a genealogy of thought that's pushing and trying to develop how we actually think about maleness and male characteristics in patriarchal societies.
Now, lastly, you also in the class talked about, which was the data was overwhelming and fascinating, the raping of men in dominant race society. Even Armenian and Jews, this was found in the Holocaust. This has been something that is categorically, it's not just a quote unquote a black thing, but it is in terms of what we're dealing with right now. But that data was absolutely amazing.
Well, thank you. Thank you. I have to, you know, at the Shoah Foundation, I stumbled across some testimonies. I'm still trying to transcribe about 20 of them. I think I've done about 10 or 18, between 10 and 18 of them, where, you know, you actually see Jewish men talking about surviving rape and sexual assault during the Holocaust. And I can't tell you how impacting these stories were. And it wasn't, you know, I think a lot of times when we study race and racism in the United States, we overlook the similarities that our situation has to other groups. We look at blackness as exceptional and unique, and in some respects it certainly is, but in others it's certainly not. And I think that one of the ways that it's actually parallel, it has a lot in common with the Holocaust and certainly the Armenian genocide, is precisely in the exploitation, sexual assault, and rape of racialized men. So I think that when we look at phallicism, when we look at the subordinate male target hypothesis or gender side, that we see an advancing of the theory that's moving simply between the lethality and death towards racialized men, towards the fetishization, eroticization, and ultimately rape, sexual coercion of racialized men within these various contexts.
And I actually lied. I said that was the last question. Actually, this is the last question coming up.
Absolutely.
For the family, because again, this is data that we've never heard before. We've never been exposed to before. Intimate partner homicide and black women not only killing in self-defense, but also the second most violent group of domestic violence is white women.
Yeah. So I mean, that's just, you know, there's going to be a lot of people who disagree if they're
sure. There's going to be some pushback, but the data.
Well, the data. It depends often how you want to read the data. I mean, the CDC reports that I showed are largely self-reports. That's their methodology. They're calling in people and they're doing a metric to nationalize their random call-ins. But you know, I think there's a lot of secondary literature that supports this now. Because now they're even trying to apply bidirectionality to white races. Bidirectionality used to be a phenomenon where it only applied to black people. So the idea was that black men kill black women and black women kill black men because black people are so violent and hypersexual as a race that domestic violence doesn't really need a study because that's just how their group is. The only people we need to really study are white people. So back in the 1930s, you'd have these articles on wife beating and tracking unemployment and alcoholism to white men beating their wives. There wasn't a lot of discussion back then about women killing men. The only literature that I could find would be when they're trying to account for homicide and they're looking at black people and they're like, oh, black women keep killing black men because black men are not faithful. So infidelity was the largest reason given for why black women kill black men. Wow. And that held true basically up to the 1980s, right? And in the 1980s, you get the Duluth model. And in that model, that says that men are the majority of the perpetrators and women are always the victims. So the only time women we use violence against men is in self-defense. And I think the literature over the last 20 or 30 years, certainly there's over 3,000 articles on male victims of intimate partner violence and homicide. When we're talking about white people, there's no articles when you talk about black people. There's no articles on black men as victims of intimate partner violence or intimate partner homicide. There's over 3,000 in 3 years.
Wow.
When you're talking about white men. So again, this tells you, this is evidence, or at least in my mind, evidence for what I mean when I talk about the kind of misandry, the anti-black misandry that guides theory. Because since its inception, since the 1930s, you've been getting accounts of black men being victims, or a large number of victims of intimate partner homicide as well as intimate partner violence. Practically every ethnography written in the 50s and 60s has given at least one or two accounts of black women beating black men. But we don't take that scholarship seriously because the hyper masculinity of black men only allows us to see them as perpetrators and not victims of domestic violence. So when you look at the raw numbers, which is what the CDC is basically giving you from their nationalized metric, then yeah, you're looking at the two largest groups of victims and perpetrators would be white men and white women, respectively 30 million and 23 million, right? 30 million white female victims, 23 million white male victims. So, and like I said, it's not an exact science because we know, I mean, if you're looking at the proportions, people do report different things, 15, 20, 30% of, same-sex victimization, et cetera. But if you say, look, the majority of the victims are, heterosexual couples, and I believe that to be true, then, the two largest groups of perpetrators and victims are white men and women. And we don't look at it that way, right? Because I mean, when you're talking about black people, you're talking about at max 5-6 million people, right? And when you're talking about white people, you're talking about people who are brutal or who are abusing 30 million people, 23, 24 million people. So, and that's largely because of population. But the reason the number is important is because it challenges the way that we think overwhelmingly about who commits violence in this country, right? And that's the point. That's not to say that white women aren't victims, et cetera, but it's to say that why do you not think of them as perpetrators? Right. Wow. And because the theory is so slanted, and there's a lot of research that challenges this idea that men are the sole perpetrators, but nonetheless we hold on to it like it's morality because it's so slanted. We never get at the truth. We never even, and here's the thing, even if that theory is true, we never ask the question if it's true. We just accept it as morality. And what I think those numbers show, at least preliminarily, and I'll certainly talk about this more in the future, is that there is a reason to believe that bidirectionality amongst blacks is not only true, but that there needs to be new theories to actually account for it.
Wow. Thank you for that, Dr. Tommy Curry. Amazing work.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Thank you.